That's better. Okay, welcome everybody to today's seminar, which is on transcending boundaries, exploring the intersections of faith and health. We've got three fantastic speakers today, Aminia Colucci, Fabian Vinegar and Sally Smith have all joined us from very diverse backgrounds, and it's going to be a really exciting series of presentations this afternoon. What we'll do is have each speaker talk for about 20 minutes. If people have immediate questions of clarification, then we will find a bit of time at the end of each just to address those. Otherwise, we will save a longer discussion until the end of the three presentations. I also just wanted to flag that after the presentations today, we have, Aminia has a film that she's going to show us. The film is about 90 minutes long, so please stay on to watch the film if you are able to. Then we'll have about a 5-minute break after the end of the presentations before we start the film. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Aminia Colucci, who is Associate Professor in Visual and Cultural Psychology at Middlesex University in the UK and Visiting Professor at the Gadjah Mada University in Indonesia. Aminia uses arts-based and visual methods, particularly photography and ethnographic film documentary in her research, teaching and advocacy activities. She's working on a number of grants at the moment, but I think the one she's going to talk to us about today is one that she leads, which is an ESRC GCRF funded project called Together for Mental Health, using collaborative visual research methods to understand experiences of mental illness, coercion and restraint in Ghana and Indonesia. So over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for organizing such an interesting event. And over to Luke, I'm gonna look in between. And thank you to Charlotte, Christian and Lou for having us here today, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other presentation as well. Several people, of course, just some key part of the research team are Ursula Reed, Diana Setiawati, Leili Kobi, Ade Basayani, Roberta Salormi, and Bulan Chaknika from Indonesia. So just acknowledging them right at the beginning. And just giving a very, very short background about how this project came about. When we decided to go ahead with this application, we kind of realized that in the past decade, now there was a different reporting of human rights abuses towards people with mental health issues have been reported in different countries, including in Ghana and in Indonesia. And both in this country, interestingly, there are laws, and in fact in Indonesia since the 70s, that actually ban the use of a form of physical restraint, which in Indonesia are known with the name of pasung, towards people with mental health issues. But this kind of practices still are present in both this country, and as we know, also in other countries. So in spite of these laws and also somewhat increased availability of mental health services, what we also noticed is in both contexts, traditional religious and spiritual practices still remain highly valued in addressing mental health issues. So it's been suggested by a few scholars, and there was a bit in a literature review where we kind of look into this issue to go more in depth, that this kind of partnership between traditional and faith-based healers and health workers can prevent human rights abuses against people with mental illness and enable access to treatment. However, although this kind of long-standing collaboration been kind of called upon for since a while, we found very little investigation looking at this relationship, and particularly looking about what actually works. So what we were interested in was when there are collaboration that seems to be working, what actually allows this collaboration to kind of work, and what do potentially successful collaboration with their limitation, what they look like. Yeah, so what actually they look. I don't know where to look, because if I look there, people on Zoom, you can see me better, but I'm giving my back. So it's a bit awkward situation, so I might have to go in between. And therefore, that's how Together for Mental Health came about. So we applied for this project with the aim of exploring attempts made by mental health professionals and faith-based traditional healers to establish collaboration, to prevent the use of coercion and improve care for people experiencing mental health issues. You might have to put the window just one person on the top, otherwise it cuts out the slides on the right. So just if you can click the one on the top, the one, yeah. Oh yeah, okay, perfect, okay. Wonderful. So there was different objectives for this project. I'm gonna just skip to this, but it was fundamentally about exploring collaboration as well as co-develop advocacy activities and starting building a south-to-south network. I'm gonna spend a few words on the method because after we're gonna watch the film, and I think we won't have time to probably talk about the film, the photography documentary after. So just I'll give you more information about the use of visual methods. But this project we can define as an applied activist interdisciplinary visual research project, which was made based mainly on two particular methods. One is a photography documentary, and the other is participatory video. And this, just to give us some background methodologically, this project, the ethnographic documentary part of it was based on a previous ethnographic documentary project I carried out in Indonesia, which is called the Breaking the Chains, Human Rights and Mental Health, where I followed always using visual ethnography as the method, a small organization in Java Island, which basically was tried to find people who were experiencing chaining, assumed practices, or caging or other form of restraint in Indonesia. And then I was following them. It was an organization made by people who lived the experience of mental health issues, who were working with the community to try to then free the person receiving mental health care. So the background for this project was Breaking the Chains, what I developed for this project. And then for the perspective of the other part of the method, which is participatory video, was based on a kind of a visual storytelling project that I co-led in Indonesia, in Australia, where we looked at the concept of recovery, what recovery meant for people from migrant refugee background in Australia. Specifically for the mental health, we did the field works, interviews with mental health workers, Islamic, Christian, Hindu, and indigenous healers, family caregivers, and persons who live the experience of mental health conditions in both countries. And then this footage was transcribed and analyzed. And basically, being a visual research project, the main outcomes of the project actually are the films themselves, but then also we have analyzed thematically the transcripts, and the one paper actually last weekend has been accepted, the Ghana paper on transcultural of psychiatry, so should be published online in the next few days. And then we already published a kind of case study paper on Indonesia, and we're going to publish another paper on Indonesia. Now, interestingly about the consent, we use a staged consent process to observe and film the person while engaging in the daily activities, as well as different kind of practices of healing and religious. And the kind of staged consent process meant that the participants' approval was acquired and checked again every time we were filming them, with them providing details about their identity, how much or what about their identity they wanted to be disclosed. While the participatory visual methods was carried out in Indonesia, unfortunately, the Ghana part of we could not do at the time. We done it with another funding stream after because of COVID. But fundamentally, participatory video is a set of techniques aimed to involve a group or community in shaping and creating their own film. In this case, the participants, which are called storyteller, they create a short film, which is based on what they want to share, and they usually also take part in the filming, the recording of the material, and contribute or carry out completely the editing of the film with support. And I use this method in a different project in mental health and human rights issues, and I can say it's a very powerful means of documenting and sharing experiences and perspective. So in Indonesia, then we produced the KPCI, is an organization of people with the experience of schizophrenia. They paired them with the students. So in these images, we can see some of this pairing to produce videos that kind of represented their experiences, which then culminated in a festival where all these 11 films were shown, and all the films are available online as part of outputs, which is also obviously the two main films. We're going to be showing Harmony today, but there is also Kabom, and then also a screening guide, which I just gave to Christian from Indonesia, which accompanies the films. So these are the two main films. Now, just giving, I'm going to check the time. So giving some of the shared learning from this study, some of the kind of common factors that we found. In terms of facilitating factors, what we found is for a number of different reasons. What actually was contributing to collaborations was the recognition of healers' roles by mental health professionals. And this was based on, as mentioned, different kind of understanding and reasons. But one of them was about the fact that traditional and faith-based healers were really required. So they were necessary in both contexts to make up for the deficit in health services, funding, and the weakening of public services. So there was a recognition by mental professionals that they actually were really something that they were needed. So they needed to kind of work with them. There was also the kind of collaboration was based on a networking of actors of different kinds, which we will show in the film later, as well as the importance of the referral between the two groups. So for the collaboration to be working was also not what we often found also in a literature, that the referral always, and also education campaigns and some kind of activities are about healers, faith-based relational healers to be educated about referring to mental health professionals, which clearly indicated only a one-way kind of collaboration. Well, what actually we found was when things were working was also when mental health professionals were able in some situations to actually think, either refer the person or being very aware that the person was also using somebody else and being completely fine with that. So it was more a two-way kind of system of going. And also negotiation around the approach to care. So what mental health care, professionals were caring for and what the healers were caring for. Obviously, we focus in our research on some kind of good practice, some example of collaboration when things were working. But then also when people were discussing about when things were not working, so what would be potentially barriers to collaborations, the main one that they discussed was around the socioeconomic factors, competitiveness among and between healers, between themselves, as well as with their professional, somehow a kind of a psychiatry, a marked category, an assumption somehow to be evidence-based and culture-free. So this is different from what actually was then the faith-based healing and traditional healers. But also the risk of undermining reputation and the livelihood of healers, because for healers, obviously, that was the way they were maintaining themselves and their communities. And so potentially the risk of then undermining what they were doing as creating some form of conflict and resentment, and also some form of education, scrutiny, and regulation that usually also went one way. So the kind of policies usually are about checking what the healers are doing, and somehow the kind of scrutiny, as if everything else that then is done by the mental health professionals is completely like okay, and there is no human rights violations. And that obviously was also problematic. This kind of assumption. Also, a potential barrier was around the complexity of healing approaches, which might conflict with the desire for portable, scalable, measurable models and techniques, because obviously these were completely different from what we often hear advocating for. And also managing the expectation, particularly family expectation, and evaluating efficacy. So these one were some of the key barriers that were explored. Then just covering a few of the other kind of going in depth about some of these kind of factors just indicated. What also was found by the research team was the pragmatic of practice differed from how collaboration is imagined, is written about in the policy, like in Ghana, there are policies around engaging with the healers, but then how people were executing that was quite different from what was written down. And the collaboration was in fact marked by diversity and improvisation rather than standardization. There were also varying degrees of formalization and professionalization within and between the different sites we explored. Health workers and healers were working with very, very limited resources. So not only the healers, but also the health workers, and also very little supervision and support. And therefore, collaboration involved a lot of negotiating, conflicting social and ethical imperatives, particularly during times of crisis. The model of collaboration, we also found that often realistically omitted the person with lived experience. So usually kind of collaboration was about the healers and mental health professional. A lot of decisions actually in terms of treatment in general are taken by the family, but people with lived experience themselves of mental health issues are excluded. So obviously, so that ideally in the ideal scenario, this collaboration will also involve the people that this collaboration have been in theory in place for. In terms of collaboration reducing human rights abuses, what we found is that sometimes there was a concern of the family, a kind of a form of coercion, like the chaining shown in the photo you can see in one of the traditional healing sites in Ghana we visited. This kind of form of coercion can kind of then be substituted by other form of coercion once the person is in care to the mental health system, including actual restraint, but also the sedation by medications that often are a kind of first generation still. And then traditional faith-based healers somehow can sometimes feel as being used to fill the gap because there is nothing else, there is not enough money for the mental health services. So therefore healers and then end up acting as emergency care, in fact. But overall, this kind of collaboration we were exploring, it seemed that with the time was reducing the practices of abuse within this kind of, at least this kind of sites. What also was interesting was the healers and health workers usually live in the same community. So they actually are sharing the same spiritual religious view of the community that they're serving. And therefore the collaboration is kind of worked out and within and to this relationship. So that kind of trust, mutual respect for each other's expertise was very central in this kind of a relationship. And that also meant that we can see it in the film later, and if you watch also the Nkabom film in Ghana, you will see a lot of this kind of very careful negotiation of status and authority. And the health workers we were working with were super careful about not crossing those kind of line and somehow making the healer feeling undermined in their knowledge about what actually was going on. So to that to maintain harmony, which is that was chosen for the film, and the respect. So they worked together also to meet a lot of ethical dilemmas in care, which included, for example, also the use of restraint in some situation, without avoiding confrontation and avoiding direct criticism. And what also was a key element of this kind of relationship was also the issue around holistic care, because in holistic we found dissatisfaction with biomedical mental health care, not only among the healers, but also the mental health professionals themselves, in terms of potential harmful effect of pharmaceuticals and the limited efficacy, seen much more as a short-term way of dealing with the issue rather than a longer term, and the importance of having more spiritual, religious, and holistic care in terms of the longer term recovery and integration of the person in the community. And therefore, we hear both from the healer's perspective, but the mental health professional as well, the need to address spiritual, social, and cultural needs. Also, the value of embodied sensory, aesthetic, social, and symbolic aspects of healing, which sometimes you will see like in the water as having this effect of cooling and calming, and developing holistic communities of care within established society of healing sites. And here we can just see a couple of quotes from Indonesia and Ghana. And also the immediate growth also was very important in terms of acknowledging the limits and uncertainty of mainstream psychiatric knowledge in both in Ghana and Indonesia, but as well as engaging with spirituality and the search for meaning as a central to human experience, including mental illness. Yeah, Abu, one of the mental health nurses we followed in Ghana, says, Ghana and most parts of Africa is religious. Most people belong to a religious group or other, and then we can't do away with that. It has to be part of the health system, which makes a lot of sense. So just reflecting a little bit on the kind of also the benefits of visual methods, which are one of the objectives of the project was also reflecting and sharing experiences around using visual methods as the primary, in fact, the only method used for this comparative study. What we noticed was the attention to symbolic and embodied aspects of healer, patient, family, health worker interactions, and the healing rituals. Also, we found to provide access to subjective experiences without forcing a particular explanation and enabling an enriched understanding. The first person audiovisual accounts in the local languages, which was unmediated by English or using the written language, it was a very empowering and destigmatizing. We also saw a growth of audiovisual culture on digital platforms, social media, to discuss issues of concern, including mental health. And so also the kind of the footage from this project also then be used for public engagement as well as for training, education, and awareness. Now, the last few minutes, I have, okay, and then also sorry to mention that we are now kind of expanding a bit, reflecting on this project as well as another HSC grant that we have finished now that we're working on the outputs, which was again in Ghana, Indonesia. And now, just last month, we are starting another agency, which is led by Ursula Reed, aimed to developing a network for mutual understanding on the potential of creative arts, including visual methods for mental health advocacy and activism in Ghana and Indonesia, building on this body of work we've been engaged with in the last few years. So because we're going to be showing Harmony later, just give me a bit more context about Harmony specific. So the sites for the Indonesian research was where there are kind of the three major organized religions in Indonesia, which are, of course, Islam in Java, Roman Catholicism in Flores, and Balinese Hinduism in Bali. So we kind of followed example of collaboration in these three sites to be able to represent the three main religions. And so we will, in the film, obviously, I hope that everybody supporting the seminar in here will watch the film, but just in case you can't. So like in Harmony in particular, we kind of see example of this psychiatrist, Dr. Wari, who actually is working with an ustad, which is taking care of one of the patients in the scene, and they kind of found a way of negotiating how to work with medication, but also so the person could be fully engaging in Islamic ritual like ruqya and other ritual where they need to be awake, and the concern of the ustad about Islamic healers around if the person is medicated in the moment they actually cannot participate. So they found a way of negotiating care. Is a good example how they've done this. This is an example from Flores. So these are Chameleon priests, and they are very much involved with the community and working with the nurses, GPs, all psychiatric in the island to try fundamentally to then work with the family to kind of creating these little houses where the people who are being chained or caged, they can actually live, they have a toilet, they can stand up, they have a bed. So it's a kind of a transition between the situation where they are being confined and a bigger form of confinement where they're kind of freer to then, but eventually they're being completely integrated in the community. So this is one of the, we actually follow one of the person who then gets freed from the chaining, and they move to live in this little house. Here in Bali, we follow a psychiatry who has started an organization called Rumah Badaya, which is also using arts as one form of activism around mental health, and is working with a kind of a cultural healer, so defined. But in Bali, we follow him in one of his kind of rituals. It goes all night, but then we also go to the psychiatrist where he takes the Rumah Badaya members, it's also called, to also do purification rituals, where he also takes part on them, realizing how important they are for Balinese people, including himself as a psychiatrist. So we followed this in a kind of big part of the film. And so that's going to be launching later on. Obviously, I kind of had to cover a few parts of the project, making sure I don't take more time than assigned. But if you want to know more about this project and also the other project I mentioned before and other visual research project in mental health, so this is the website movement, and you can find some videos there, and we're going to be releasing also this film in the next few months in this platform, but also our social media and YouTube channel where you can find whatever films about this project have been released so far. And I think that's 20 minutes approximately, so I will end here. And again, it was really odd going between, but I hope somehow it worked, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Emilia. That was really fascinating. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, does anybody have any immediate questions of clarification, either in the room or online for Emilia? See any hands up?
I have a very short question. Just something. Was there any role for like human rights or like legal profiles involved in this project, like in terms of denunciation or following a case of abuse, or was there any kind of a more legal angle?
Well, I mean, we kind of also involved the Ministry of Health in this case, in both country. They were participants also in the study. And also, I mentioned advisory group, a steering committee kind of came across different kind of sectors. So in that kind of sense, yes, in terms of having a Human Rights Commission, the recent one. So there was nobody to involve in that. But what has been also interesting and also follow a bit of one of Norman Sartorius' criticism around the basically policies and laws ultimately don't, they don't really go that far if then there is not an alternative or resources to be able to support alternatives. So like in Indonesia, Pasung chaining and caging is illegal since more than 40 years, almost 50 inside, in fact, but nobody reports it because what is alternative? Because many families, as I showed in my film Breaking the Chains, which is a kind of background for this work, family don't want to chain the family member or cage them, but they clearly they often, or most of the time, have no other way. And so there's a lot of understanding of the community, and sometimes the community themselves to ask the families to actually restrain the person. So the laws and obviously policy often don't reflect what actually is people's life. So,
thank you. Okay. Any other questions?
We can get some of the end eventually all together after we hear you.
So I'm delighted to announce our second speaker, who's Dr. Fabian Vinegar, who trained in medical anthropology at Oxford University and the University of Hong Kong. He's now a senior research fellow at the Professorship of Spiritual Care at the University of Zurich, where he's looking at the intersection of health and spirituality in the World Health Organization and other agencies in the United Nations. He's participating in the URPP Digital Religions project on the transformation of religion through digital technologies, and investigating chaplaincy in virtual healthcare environments, the emergence of new digital forms of spiritual care. And Fabian's going to talk to us about the Gospel of Health, then and now, historical remarks on the spiritual dimension of health in WHO. Over to you, Fabian.
Thank you. I'm just going to set my timer. Yeah, well, thank you so much for your invitation. It's really an honor to be here, to speak here, also to be here in person on so many Zoom meetings. So it's a relief to get out again and do it like we used to do. So yeah, I'm going to be speaking about this project on the spiritual dimension of health at the World Health Organization. It was a 4-year project, and I'm going to cut to the chase, so you get as much of the empirical, historical stuff as possible. And also it's based on a book which is available, open access online. So in case you want to dive deeper. So yeah, like other prestigious medical institutions, the World Health Organization is, an ostensibly secular, highly secularized sphere. And its credibility really rests on the scientific reputation, of course. But at the same time, it also constitutes what has been described as a quote unquote latent religious logic. And so religious motivations regularly surface within the organization, and they of course also permeate the global health discourse, which historically owes a lot of to religious actors. But if you look at a textbook on global health, you will very rarely really find a substantial discussion on this. And so this is curious because many pioneers of global health, such as Paul Farmer, were inspired by at some point by religious encounters. And in the words of Arthur Kleinman, for example, there is a tendency in global health discourse to cloak his words, religious values in secular language. And so, as we all know, the word religion brings up many connotations for people, and they can be very strong and negative, and gravitate towards, systemic problems, violence, corruption, populism, conservatism, patriarchy. And so, for historical reasons, religion has, in common parlance, really become an antithesis to a modern, equitable, cosmopolitan, global civil society in which WHO participates and to which it hopes to contribute. And so if you look at WHO's engagement with explicitly named religion, there really is very little to be found. And so what we've done with this project is we looked at a closely related but still different word, which is that of spirituality. So if we broaden our search to the spiritual dimension of health, we really do find a red thread woven into the duration of the organization's existence. And so I'm going to start with the first episode in this history. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, medicine was changing very rapidly, and physicians were trained, who were trained in the Hippocratic tradition, were replaced by those trained in laboratory-based medicine. And so the reduction of the patient to a biochemical phenomenon really caused a backlash among some physicians who felt that something was going missing. And another development at the time was also recognition of the international nature of public health. And this was brought, among others, by waves of cholera, which threatened Europe and especially its colonies. Also the rise of air travel, the atomic bomb, and also development of socialist medicine by the Soviets. And there was another current which was really influential at the time, which was the emergence of political holism. And one of the chief proponents of that was a South African statesman, and I should add, eminent racist, Jan Smuts, who strongly influenced the founding of the League of Nations and the United Nations system. And really it was in this context that the WHO was founded, or the ideas that led to the WHO's founding fermented. And WHO was founded with this aspiration to reach out to the whole world. And it was given this now famous preamble, which contained this holistic definition of health. And, you probably all know it, I'm going to repeat it. It states that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. Now, at the first World Health Assembly in Geneva, held in 1948, which you see pictured here, not 1 hour passed before someone pointed out that this definition was missing from something. It was literally in the first hour of the first meeting in 1948 of the World Health Organization. And it was Philipp Etter, the Swiss federal councillor, who attended the event. And he called on WHO to incorporate what he called the spiritual dimension of health, which he found lacking in this definition. Now, in the first 30 years after this remarkable moment, spirituality rarely came to attention of WHO staff, and partly because the human rights discourse framed humanitarian issues, and partly also due to an open conflict over population control policy between the Catholic Church and the WHO's first Director General, Brock Chisholm. Now, in the 1970s, WHO began to rethink its top-down approach to of disease eradication, and it began to create a more sustainable, or explore a more sustainable model of medical care. And through this work, WHO began to exchange with the Christian Medical Commission. And this is a commission of the World Council of Churches, which is a very short walk ahead of away from the WHO headquarters in Geneva. And the commission had a lot of experience in caring for rural populations, especially in Africa. And this really caught the attention of the Director General at the time, who was Halfdan Mahler. And he was a son of a pastor and a very close acquaintance of the Christian Medical Commission's first director. And so Mahler was very impressed by the work of the commission, and he began to explore with the CMC the possibility of cooperation, and they created a joint standing committee. And this really resulted in the formulation of the key principles of what would later become the primary healthcare paradigm, and which was then formalized in the Health for All initiative. And the wording of the language of this Health for All initiative is still around in the organization today. And so in his speeches, Mahler really began to explicitly refer to his spiritual dimension. And he referred to the launch of the Health for All initiative as a quote unquote sacred moment of spiritual and intellectual awakening. And he went as far as calling WHO a temple of health. And so for Mahler, universal primary healthcare was a gospel of health for all. So those were his words. But the growing recognition of the spiritual dimension, the relevance of the spiritual dimension within WHO was not just a feat of Christian advocates. In the early 1980s, there were representatives from India, Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean regions. And they began to argue that the WHO's rollout of primary healthcare should also include a spiritual dimension of health. So there were actually different lobbying groups, not just the Christian ones. And in 83, 84, at the 36th and 37th World Health Assemblies, this really became a central topic of discussion. And so we have a fair amount of historical, of archival material showing how at the World Health Assembly, so the parliament, so to speak, of WHO was discussing the merits of a spiritual dimension of health. And this again gained support from some quite unlikely groups, including the members of the non-aligned movement. This was an alliance of former colonial states who shared a strong interest in this more equitable medical healthcare paradigm. And for them, in this, the spiritual dimension of health shared the critique of the Western-based status quo. So if Western colonial medicine was materialistic, technocratic, short-sighted, environmentally destructive, and vertically administered and so on, then the alternative was spiritual. It was an expression of local and national cultures. It was sustainable. It was provided through bottom-up initiatives and so on. And so the spiritual was in a way the antithesis of the material, and in this way also gained some ideological currency in this discourse. And they succeeded in this World Health Assemblies to vote through an unbinding invitation for member states to add a spiritual dimension of health to their health programs, and I quote, in accordance with their social and cultural patterns. And we see some images illustrating the poster of the Alma Ata conference, and we see Afton Mahler on the left in the context of a small pox eradication. Abdul Rahman Al-Awadi was a very strong proponent of the spiritual dimension at that time. So that this motion succeeded at all is really an astounding feat, and it's practically unknown today, and it's unimaginable, almost unimaginable that a spiritual dimension would be debated at the World Health Assembly today. And I think it would also, even at that time, a religious dimension of health would have been a much harder sell. But a spiritual dimension found appeal across quite a wide range of stakeholders. Now, the WHO's Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office, or EMRO, had the strongest interest in the spiritual dimension, and the Southeast Asian Regional Office and the Western Pacific Regional Offices also occasionally referred to it, but by far the most activity was at EMRO. And in the Eastern Mediterranean region, spirituality really over the following decades, the 80s, began to figure as a way to gain support for public health measures, and especially a fairly successful campaign against tobacco use. And in 1989, this culminated in the Amman Declaration on Islamic Lifestyles. And this provided very detailed guidelines for behavior based directly with citations on the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So the problem with the spiritual dimension at EMRO, however, was already evident in these discussions at the World Health Assemblies. And one of those problems were that it pitched this Islamic world, a moral Islamic world, against a bankrupt American-led imperial order. And so it also became instrumentalized for a very conservative and homophobic morality. Now, in another episode in this story was that of traditional medicine. And I was really happy to see before in the talk we heard before about traditional healers in Ghana and Indonesia that traditional medicine still found a solid of points of connection with this bit here. Because in the early 70s, WHO became interested in what it called traditional medicine in the hope that it would provide the manpower. So also manpower is a quote, needed for primary healthcare reform in the developing countries because it was too expensive to fund the way things are funded in the global north. So manpower and traditional healers were referred to and resorted to, at least in theory. And so this was inspired again by the Christian Medical Commission's interest in local healers, and also by this ostensible success of the Chinese barefoot doctors, because they at the time had very much impressed some Western medical experts. And it was also advocated by newly decolonized nations who felt that their local medical traditions contributed to their cultural and economic independence. And so here again, we see also national ideologies intermingling with the spiritual dimension and with public health concerns. So in the 1990s, the herbal medicine really emerged as a huge industry in Africa and Asia. And in this context as well, in each of these contexts, WHO produced this kind of distinctive accommodation of this inexplicable, quote unquote, spiritual aspects of traditional medicine, which it variously ignored or helped to commodify. And so here on the slides, we see some of the images taken, the WHO traditional medicine strategy and Contact, the magazine of the CMZ, showing traditional healers, and also a photo of a training of traditional midwives, which was used to show how traditional healers could be used, instrumentalized, however cooperated with, you might say. Now, the next episode was that of palliative care, and the spiritual dimension really became most widely accepted within palliative care, and within WHO's position on palliative care. But interestingly, despite the recognition of the relevance of the spiritual dimension in palliative care, WHO documents really just mention it without elaborating on it. So it's quite unclear what is meant by this acknowledgement that spirituality is relevant at the end of life. And what is meant by spirituality was never really clearly explicated. And so by historical coincidence, the WHO began to take seriously palliative care around the time when HIV was also accelerating its spread worldwide. And this led to a kind of mutual validation where, to the extent that the new palliative care approach was recognized as appropriate for HIV/AIDS victims, it seemed plausible that the WHO also had to contain a palliative component, which included a spiritual dimension. So there's much to say about palliative care, but I'm going to move on briskly to the next episode to give you a good overview, and that is the WHO SRPB. So a bit of an acronym there. And so this is one of the most interesting episodes which happened in the mid-1990s when the WHO's Division of Mental Health, who was quite, you might say, liberal or open-minded at the time, developed an instrument for the assessment of quality of life, which departed quite radically from most such instruments at the time. And the WHO, as it was called, WHO Quality of Life instrument, was developed through a systematic consultation process across different cultural settings, and it measured subjective well-being rather than the functional normality of a person. And again, soon after WHO was created, the division began to develop an extension to it, an additional module to it, and it called it Spiritual, Personal, and Religious Beliefs. So SRPB, hence WHO SRPB. And this SRPB module was developed through the same kind of cross-cultural consultation through which the WHO call was developed. But this time it was brought together religious experts, not health psychologists and so on. It brought together theologians and a representative group of religious experts to find commonalities across theological questions. And they did so using this quite rigorous approach. And the resulting instrument is really quite remarkable and unfortunately hasn't been widely used. However, again, the spiritual dimension didn't disappear with that. And what we saw then are some of the more recent, more contemporary developments happening. And the first one, which is really worth noting, is that, as many of you probably know, that religion became more widely legitimized in the United Nations system after around about the year 2000, early 2000s. And then within WHO, this was reflected in part in an attempt to forge collaborations with religious communities thought to be of some benefit to the organization. And one example, in 2003, Ted Karp was employed. He was an Episcopal priest as a partnerships officer, and his task was to build closer relationships with their religious actors. And 2 years later, WHO contracted a major study to be done called the African Religious Health Program, to map quote unquote religious health assets in the African countries in the context of HIV/AIDS. And in 2009, there was a major 6-day conference organized by a group of Seventh-day Adventists, reportedly 600 members of the church, and WHO representatives attended. So quite a big deal, which, however, evoked also strong opposition from some former WHO members who were concerned of this involvement of religious actors in, secular affairs. And this really placed on hold a lot of the collaboration at that time. And however, again, it did keep going, this story. A few examples here is the polio eradication programs in Pakistan, Somalia, Nigeria, Afghanistan. There were some religious considerations that went into that, and especially also the West African Ebola crisis, which really took into consideration the needs of religious communities to some extent. And now, most recently, the WHO's response to the COVID-19 pandemic really, again, demonstrated the relevance of religion to the work of WHO. And this most recent episode, Sally Smith is far more qualified to speak on, and gladly she's here with us today. So I'll leave this bit for her to comment on if we have time. And so I'm just going to end here with a brief conclusion, and that is that, as you can see, going to go here to the conclusion. As you can see, for much of WHO's history, this spirituality has really regularly surfaced in its work. However, in the past 2 decades, the spiritual dimension of health became part of a broader discourse of civil society engagement, which approached spirituality as a matter of engaging with external actors, rather than as an aspect of WHO's own holistic mandate, if you look very closely and think very hard about its definition of health. And so this, you could argue, brought a shift from this shift from the spiritual dimension to faith engagement, has some clear advantages, but I think it also has some costs and brings a lot of political complexities, which are a huge topic and something for future historians and political scientists to have a look at. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention. I hope it was interesting to you. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Fabian. I've just been told we need to wait a few minutes for the captioner before we start the third talk. So we do have a little bit of time for questions now, or if anyone wants to just take a quick break and put the kettle on, we will.
Yeah, could we just have a 5-minute break?
5-minute break, and but particularly people have any immediate questions in response to Fabian's talk? No?
I mean, I know you said it's a topic discussed by in the future and very complex. Just was interested because when I saw the WHO SRPPB instrument, I'm very happy when I saw it. In fact, I work with a team in India. We translated the tool in Hindu, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna contribute to this potential. I told them I'm gonna put on the website. Thinking from then on, all these countries we're gonna have different languages. We're gonna be seeing finally studies on quality of life, which also include the spiritual dimension. But then every single study where I've been involved as a reviewer or whatever reason, including the quality of life instrument, they never had the spiritual religious one involved. Never, like literally, I never seen really studies, very, very rarely. So what is your perception? Why there was all this effort put to actually develop this tool, so much attention to how to develop it, and then it just was like people don't even know that they exist? What is your perception?
Should I briefly answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. It's something I was wondering as well. You see these themes come and go in the WHO, and we've been working with WHO very closely for the past few years around culture and health. And 5 years ago, it was everywhere, and now it's really died down again. So you see the things come in waves. So it's really interesting. I'm wondering too why these things are not more systematically embedded as part of work, everyday work. So it would be great to have your.
But also yours, maybe we can have yours and then yours about culture as well. I'm
I'm
very
interested
curious
in that as well,
to see
actually.
what is it like, because I think it's important to understand why they come and go. Maybe we can try to change some of these patterns.
I mean, I think every situation is unique, and if you look at the WHO call SRPB, right around the time when it came out, there was a change of staffing at the department, and their change of staffing meant that there was a shift towards a different instrument. It was also connected to a new director general who had a very economic kind of outlook, and this was reflected in a way of measuring a well-being which is tied to economic productivity, and that was the DALI, the disability adjusted life years. And the group, interested in that were not so much interested in subjective, well-being, and especially not, spirituality was like the epitome of that, right? So it's easy to see why that kind of fell off the wagon at that point. But I mean, there's another question of why didn't researchers outside of WHO do anything or not much with it? And I don't have an answer to that. I think it just wasn't communicated very well.
What's your view around?
My view, I think it would adhere quite closely to yours, really. I think the personnel who are in position in organisations such as WHO have a huge bearing on the priorities that are set. And again, there's been a change in regional director, a new strategy, and that does make a difference, but also funding, because it's an organisation, as we all know, that doesn't have lots of secure funding, and there's a lot of opportunities that are taken in response to where there's money available at a particular point in time, and where people can usefully try to demonstrate something. And so I think some of those really more slightly logistical, prosaic things actually do have a huge impact. But like you say, why that then doesn't get reflected in research. I'm not sure that would be, I would say the same for culture. I haven't really thought about that. But with the cultural aspect of what we're doing, it's still there, it's still in the documents. And I like the spirituality, the words are there, but it's what that really means. They're not often very unpacked and explained explicitly as to how they're being used. So I think it's quite easy to write something and assume either that everybody knows what it means, or just hope that no one's going to ask. I don't know, it's really a bit cynical. So yeah, it's easy to think something in words. It's much harder to then demonstrate it in action, isn't it? I mean, it's great that the words are there though, still, so they haven't completely been forgotten, because it does mean a lot to be able to point to something on paper and say, well, it is still part of your strategy. Yeah, but the devil's in the detail, isn't it? What that really means.
Can I add maybe something, because when you started talking about kind of the initial person that bring the spiritual dimension, you said that there was this perception that something was missing in the kind of mechanistic, rational work of the WHO. And I feel that maybe that sense of something missing is kind of necessary to re-engage an approach, and then you need to lose the approach to feel again that something's missing. You know, it's like this cyclical perception that there's something else. You know, there is something that we're not considering. There's a special spiritual dimension, and I imagine that this sort of integration between WHO and religion cannot be kind of settled for once and for all, like a contract. You know, you will have these cycles. I don't know, it's just a kind of hypothesis, but maybe it resonates with your data somehow.
Yeah, it's interesting that at the turn of the century, you know, and when this new generation of laboratory-based physicians really became the new kind of elite, there was something missing, you know, for a lot of people. They were saying, okay, but a doctor has to be at the bedside, and you know, there's kind of a humanistic aspect to being a doctor, and which you can't reduce to the laboratory bench. And this discussion has, you know, never disappeared. You know, we still kind of variations on the same theme still going on, right? You know, within the name of patient-centered medicine, or whatever. I mean, there's so many different variations of this.
Or recovery in mental health. You also have that sense of hope and something that goes beyond treatment. Is clinical or is personal? You know, it's like, I don't know.
Could it also be that the term spiritual, because when you mentioned at the very beginning, like they don't talk about religion, they talk about spiritual dimension. Could also be thinking about what Felicity said, that it just gets kind of choked with the cultural aspect, because maybe it's a difficult topic, maybe because religion and faith and spirituality are part of culture, and then just kind of it's, I have no idea, but it feels that it could be like a difficult thing to approach when you're trying to do a study or something. And so instead of naming it openly, you're just like in culture, and just let people assume things.
Yeah, and definitely with the cultural work, the spiritual and religious is sort of folded
Exactly,
into that. Yeah.
It's kind of a hierarchy of euphemisms, right? So you have religion, then you have spirituality, then you have culture, then you have maybe local, then you have maybe, I don't know, community-based. It's just, yeah.
There's a question.
We have captions.
There's a question.
Matilda, do you have a question?
Yes, I'm just typing something.
Oh, okay. Rosie, can we come to you quickly?
Hi, yeah, hope you can hear me. Interesting discussions. I'm sat in my office at King's College. It comes up on my profile, so thank you. Really nice opportunity to hear about some of these issues. I was just thinking through as a researcher and about the lack of kind of consideration or using that scale, and I just wonder to what extent our own background and the fact that many of us as Northern researchers, maybe religion doesn't play, or spirituality doesn't play a massive part in our lives, and how much our kind of positionality and our own beliefs plays into the fact that because it's there, right, in all the qualitative interviews we do, spirituality comes up the entire time. I wonder if it's our positionality, and the fact that we're not as massive priority for us as individuals, and how much you guys think that's influenced the lack of use.
That's a great question. Can we put that question on hold until after Sally's done her presentation, then everyone can address it together? So I've got it noted. I think we are able to move on with the talks now. Okay. Oh, yeah. So, Sally, hello, Sally. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. Really delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Sally Smith, who is an independent consultant with the Epidemic and Pandemic Preparedness and Prevention Department at WHO. She's also a visiting lecturer at the Leeds School of Medicine and a co-convener of the Anglican Health and Community Network Anglican Alliance with expertise in global health development, religion, community engagement and HIV. And also worked for 14 years at UNAIDS, working on community engagement on HIV with faith-based organisations there. Sally graduated from Glasgow University in 2018 with a doctorate in practical theology, also looking at religion in the United Nations. So obviously some very clear links between our speakers here. And Sally's going to talk to us today about faith-based organisations responding to pandemics and epidemics, partnerships, perspectives. Thank you so much, Sally. Over to you.
Hello, and just opening the PowerPoint. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to Felicity and Chen and the colleagues at Exeter. It really is a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And thanks to Ermina and Fabian for two fabulous presentations. I'm seriously tempted to take my presentation from the back end forwards, actually, after that discussion in the question and answer just now. But I'll start with it from the beginning. We've got a lot of picture slides at the beginning, but just to say that this presentation is going to draw on my personal lessons learned from a 39-year career and trying to work at that intersection of public health, faith actors, national health and community systems and the UN, working together in pandemic and epidemic prevention and response. And out of that, the themes of my life and work have been women and their work, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and the intersection of religion, culture and public health. So I started off, my husband and I went as medical missionaries to Nepal in 1984. I realized that next year that's going to be 40 years ago. We went to Nepal, which is at that stage was a Hindu kingdom, and it was illegal to change anyone's religion. And so it was very complex political and religious environment. And we went there as technical professionals. The idea was to deliver medical services and just one second, if you can just hold fire a second, to deliver medical services and to train other Nepali people to take over that work. So there's the second two phases. If you could just hold on that picture for a second, the presentation will cover the second two phases of my work, which was 14 years in Geneva, working with the UNAIDS organization in their community engagement team. There I was supporting engagement of people living with HIV, people living with HIV, gay men, drug users, sex workers, and the faith community in the HIV response. And in that work, I worked with UNAIDS to develop a strategy for faith engagement in the HIV response, and also worked with Azza Karam in UNFPA to set up the interagency task force on faith and development across the whole of the UN. I did a PhD during that time looking at how religious discourse over 10 years had affected the political language at the negotiations at the UN on HIV, and I'll come to that later. And then the third phase of my life, I'm now retired, but have been teaching health education and health promotion at Leeds Nuffield on the MPH, and also have been working for the last 3 years in the epidemics department of WHO in response to the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to whiz through a whole lot of pictures of Nepal at the beginning to set a very early scene of working in a community setting, and then move to the global scene and how some of that experience has been translated. So you can go on to the picture of the mountains now. We worked in a hill hospital that was a day's walk from the nearest road, 6 hours on a bus, and then a 6 to 8 hour walk. And we were the last hospital between the road 6 hours south and Tibet, which was 6 days north on foot. And the next pictures of the house we lived in. And this is our cooking we cooked on either gas, if we could get any, on bottled gas, or on firewood. The next picture is of the hospital itself, which has been considerably developed since we were there. It was much more simple in those days. The next picture is of my work in those early days. I was responsible as the supervisor for a 50-bed hospital with approximately 200 to 300 outpatients a day. We had operating theatres. Remember, we had no running water, only generators for electricity, and we were a day's walk from the nearest road. And I think this is very common for many faith-based health service providers in many countries, even today. Next picture shows a lady cooking on a similar stove in her home, and we had many burns injuries coming into the hospital. We saw everything that was walked in, that was carried in. Anybody that was walked or carried into the hospital, we attempted to provide care for. The next one shows someone on the back of a porter in a basket being carried to the hospital. They may have been brought for 2 or 3 days. And the young man there in a wheelchair was someone who had had epilepsy and fallen from a tree. He now lives in Kathmandu and runs a community for many people who have different disabilities. The next slide shows the team going out in the community health program. We had a community health program that ran across four of the districts in that region. And the next two, 3 slides show some of the challenges to travel. This is called a twing, where you climb up and sit in the wagon, which then on the next slide you'll see goes down on a pulley and goes across the river, and the guys will haul you across to the other side. It was a very mountainous region in which we lived, and the next picture shows the wagon halfway across the river. So I think the reason I wanted to show some of those slides, they're from the 1980s and 90s, were some of the challenges of working in a public health a public health and community health program right out in a remote area. But those people were very religious people, and they had a multiplicity of faiths and beliefs, and that was integral to their life and our work as well. And although we were not there to convert people, we were there to provide medical care. It's not our role as medical practitioners. It is our role to understand people's culture and their tradition and their beliefs, and help them to see how that they affect both their current health condition and how they might recover from that. And much of my life following that work has been to enable faith communities to develop health education programs. So the community health program had a mothers and child's program. It also had a water program to develop ways of protecting the water supplies. And we also had an adult literacy program. And it was working in that adult literacy program for many young girls who were taken out of school at the age of 12 or 13 to be married. By the time they were 17, 18, had several children who were unable to continue their education. That became a real place where we could engage with some of these young mothers, help them to regain the opportunity to continue their education, and also provided a format for what was to come next, which was in the early 1980s when HIV entered Nepal. And many of these young women then became infected with HIV. And there were serious problems for the families in a cultural and religious context, where if illness befalls a family, if any misfortune befalls a family, the traditional beliefs there were that it was the woman's fault. She had failed in her duties to pray for the family. And so if a young woman or her baby were diagnosed with HIV, then she would often have been thrown out of the family. So to go to that slide, yes, please. So I'd like to stay on the slide with the data, please. Sorry. So 1 in 3 women report experiencing physical or sexual violence by a partner in their lifetime. And in some settings, up to 45% of adolescent girls report that their first sexual experience was forced. So it was in that context that I began to engage in HIV work and helped to set up an HIV control program for the United Mission to Nepal, which also had a hydroelectric power program. It had adult literacy programs across the country, and it had schools and university education. So my job was to design an HIV education program that integrated HIV into the work of the whole of the mission. And part of that was to then train others to take that work forward. And the next picture shows some of the nurses that we trained in that program who continue to work on HIV. And and sexual and reproductive health and rights. I've whistled through what was 16 years of work in about 4 or 5 minutes, I hope. But I wanted to give you that context because I think many of the cultural situations in many, many countries where there is an intersection of public health with religion and culture face many of those similar issues today. And the challenges to bring forward approaches to public health that include human rights and approaches to gender and women's empowerment in those contexts can be extremely challenging. So the next slide moves to when I moved then with my husband to Geneva. He worked for the World Health Organization and I worked for UNAIDS for the next 16 years. And in that context, as I said before, I was sitting in the team working with communities. I was working with the networks of people living with HIV, the networks of drug users, sex workers, gay men, and all different types of community groups. But over time, I was asked to lead their work on the work with faith-based organizations. And we did a collaborative partnership approach with many of the faith-based organizations to develop a strategy for UNAIDS on faith-based engagement in the AIDS response that was translated into the UN languages and launched in each of the regions. That was launched in I think 2009, 2010. And over those years, we then began to work with our country offices to help them strengthen the engagement with faith communities. And in 2014-15, we then had a grant from the US government to work more intensively with religious leaders and community groups on a program that was looking both at high-level policy, but also then at grassroots engagement around issues of human rights and around issues of gender, and particularly some of the cultural and religious beliefs around sex and sexuality that were a challenge to young people as they sought to move forward as young people of faith in a context where their traditional faith leaders didn't accept the realities of their life. And we had some really interesting conversations with them. So the first slide there was part of the work we did with the UN, where we took religious leaders to the UN to help campaign for a strong decision point around pediatric treatment for HIV. It was a good entry point for religious leaders who didn't necessarily, some of them, want to discuss more of the sensitive issues around gender and human rights, but were very keen to champion the rights of children living with HIV, for whom at that time the treatment options were deteriorating. So we then took that discussion to the Vatican, where we were able to then host a high-level meeting with, sorry, the Vatican's the previous one, please. We were able to host no, the next one. Okay, there we go. So the idea there was that we then came with some of those religious leaders who'd been involved in getting advocacy for the strong decision point on children's treatment. We brought them together at the Vatican with members from high-level representatives from pharmaceutical companies for whom there wasn't a strong business case to develop a effective drugs for children living with HIV, as because we were able to prevent mother-to-child transmission more effectively, the market of children infected with HIV to take up those drugs was shrinking. And yet there's a strong religious and ethical case to provide treatment for those children. So that was an important piece of work to encourage the pharmaceutical companies to develop appropriate drugs. A 41-point action plan was developed, following which those companies reported on their actions every 18 months for the next 2 years. And that work is ongoing. But it not only provided the opportunity to have effective treatment, it also provided the opportunity for the opening of dialogue between some of the religious leaders around some of these more sensitive issues. So then the next slide shows the third element of that program, which was to take those conversations to a country level and enable young people to talk to some of their cultural and religious leaders, the community leaders, teachers and headmasters and headmistresses around the challenges that young people faced. And the World Health Organization, the World Council of Churches was able to host a number of discussions in countries between religious leaders and young people, which then enabled them to take forward some work within the religious communities, opening up spaces for dialogue and thinking about how to provide safe spaces for young people in changing some of the practices that put them at risk. And then the final slide on that set was working with that same coalition of partners on a clergy testing campaign for HIV, encouraging religious leaders to test themselves for HIV and encourage others in the community to be tested for HIV. Again, a whistle-stop tour through what was 15 years worth of work with multiple partners. But I wanted to show, again, a little of that, because all of that work has laid the foundations for what we've done with WHO in the last 3 years. And much of this work we've been able to do in the last few years with a large number of partners, I have to say, is built on foundations that have been laid before by many other partners. And so this slide that you're looking at is just, I've only put in here 3 slides on my PhD, but I think it relates to the discussion that we had during the break about the policy issues, because my PhD was a critical discourse analysis of 4 political declarations on HIV and AIDS that were negotiated at the UN 5 years apart. So 2001, 2006, 2011, and 2016. Just one second. And what I did there was to look at how a traditional religious and national sovereignty discourse was used in the negotiations by some member states to limit language around human rights, gender and sexuality in the document, and to remove some of that language. And it was countered by some of the secular member states with approaches that were entirely secular. They were around human rights, scientific evidence and gender. But there was no religious discourse that was brought to the negotiations by the largely secular member states. So if you look at the next slide, the findings, when I did a very detailed critical discourse analysis of these 4 declarations, it was quite clear that the public health discourse was dominant. It was closely followed by human rights, gender equality and community engagement discourse that you would expect. But those 2 discourses work together in pairs, and the traditional religious discourse was present in the text of all the political declarations on HIV/AIDS. It worked hand in hand with a hardline national sovereignty discourse to limit biomedical and rights-based approaches to HIV prevention and SRHR in the text, and to exclude references to key populations and most risk populations to HIV, and to influence the framing of women and girls in a very conservative and traditional way, to an extent that adolescents and young people were portrayed as passive victims who lacked any agency, any information or capacity to protect themselves from HIV infection. And the next set of findings, please. The broad religious discourse, which I've just documented from all of that 30-year work that we've done before, was completely missing from the negotiations room. And whilst you find a very broad religious discourse amongst the faith-based organisations that are working in health across the world, there's none of that in the negotiation room. And it was because much of that discourse is taking place in countries with a much broader politico-religious engagement. And many of those countries, when they sit in negotiations at the member states, are entirely scientific and secular and refuse to, because of the separation of faith and state, they refuse to allow any discussion of religion in the room. But the result of that is that those member states that do not separate out faith and state, who have a very hardline conservative religious position, have an expanded space to take over to take over the conversation, and that then dominates the resulting text. So it was a fascinating set of results from that. And as I say, you've got 3 slides here on what was a 10-year study, but I think it does pertain to the conversation we were having a moment or 2 ago, because WHO, its governing body, are member states. They're not civil society. Within WHO, civil society are observers in the board. And so they don't have the opportunity. They can make a statement, they can make an intervention, but they can't actually contribute to the decision making. And so I think when we look at public health globally, we need to look at this this increasingly religio-politicized forum in which we are living and working, because it is actually affecting a lot of what we are trying to work on today. So those were the recommendations from the report. But again, I'm not going to major on that. I think I wanted to make the point that much of what we've been talking about in terms of the failure of secular public health to address religious issues is much more complex and is also challenged by the way that policy is negotiated. So I have 3 slides on the Ebola response, which then show how we were able to work with communities in the Ebola response with WHO to introduce the faith partners into the setting of the religious approaches to the burial protocol, and how we were then able to use some of those approaches in the work around COVID. So these are 3 slides from a teaching set that I use at Leeds University, but we have I won't show this this video clip, but we start with a video clip of a Sky News reportage of some burials of people who have died from Ebola in 2015, and how that sensational language escalates the panic within the community. WHO then worked with, and you can show the next slide, please. WHO then pulled in a number of the faith partners that they had worked with on HIV. I was also involved from my work within UNAIDS, and a whole group of partners came together to try and help broaden out the burial protocol to include considerations of religion. And then I then went to Sierra Leone with the WHO team to help implement that safe and dignified burial protocol, and work with some of the other partners on helping to, through their networks, work with the communities to include religious leaders in putting forward the public health messages and break down those barriers of fear and build up meaningful trust and communications around the Ebola response. And when I went and did a focus group with the Interreligious Council in Sierra Leone, as a result of that engagement, they said, when you listen to us, that's when the epidemic changed. That's when the epidemic began to recede. And again, it's about those perceptions and including people from the religious community in helping to not only design the response, but also evaluate and implement it. So I've just got 4 or 5 slides on this last 3 years. And I say I apologize for talking very fast and giving you a whistle-stop tour, but I hope what it's given you is some snapshots of things that we can connect and think about more in the dialogue. So I was invited to support the Epidemic and Pandemic Control Department in engaging with faith communities at the beginning of the pandemic. So next slide, please. The early engagement in 2020 was at the request of those faith communities to provide technical briefings and to share accurate health information. And many of these networks have huge health infrastructure across the world. So they were looking for that kind of up-to-date technical information and would then provide that to their own colleagues. We co-developed a practical guidance document, and a number of the international partners also then got involved in advocacy for equitable access to vaccines. Next slide, please. Over the two years, we developed the practical guidelines. Dr. Tedros himself then engaged in a high-level dialogue with religious leaders that was hosted by Religions for Peace in 2021. And we collaborated together with UNICEF on an advocacy series for vaccine equity access, and had a series of webinars where faith-based partners were talking about their work to build advocacy for uptake of the vaccine in the context of a lot of fear and quite a lot of conservatively religious motivated and politically motivated obfuscation of the facts and a lot of misinformation about the accuracy and the effectiveness of those vaccines. So that webinar series was very important. We then worked on developing a strategy. We co-developed that with the network, a strategy for engaging faith and religious leaders and faith communities in health emergencies. And then late in 2021, co-hosted over 3 months a global conference. So the methodology for that engagement was to have a two-way dialogue. It built on all of that work that has happened with many other partners over many years in UNAIDS and in other places, and as Fabian has documented in some of the departments of WHO, that two-way dialogue, that mutual respect, not just telling communities what to do, but actually listening to their experiences and their experience, and building that trust together and working on supportive goals, including the whole of society in the response, as well as that diversity of faiths. We acknowledge the historical partnerships, and in 2022, the Faith Network was then formalized. So there is now an opportunity for faith partners to join the WHO Faith Network. That enables them to take part in all of these activities, but it also enables faith actors to take the beginning steps towards becoming a civil society organisation in official relations with WHO, which would then enable them to make statements at the governing body, the World Health Assembly. Still not to engage in policy making, but to engage in dialogue and provide statements. So it's another way of strengthening that collaboration. So the goal of the strategy was to enable more effective responses to health emergencies by strengthening that collaboration. The idea is that it would result in more people being better protected from health emergencies and enjoying better health and well-being. And that what we have done then in the conference is that we were able to then bring some examples from countries where WHO has partnered with the Ministry of Health and faith organisations in the response to the pandemic, and they've talked about what that collaboration looked like. So the strategy defines how WHO and faith partners will work together. It's a guidance note for staff, it's an advocacy tool, it's a set of principles, and it's a list of potential actions. And the last couple of slides, we then had 3 communities of practice working to develop some of these resources, and developing the strategy, devising a checklist for future pandemics, and engaging in looking at what areas we might want to do some collaborative research in. So the next phase of this work is that the WHO Health Director, Dr. Tedros, when he met with Religions for Peace Director, he actually asked for a faith commission, and we're in the process at the moment of developing the scope of that commission. We're hoping that it will be launched sometime in the next year, and it would be accompanied by a Lancet series of hopefully 4 to 6 articles documenting the evidence of faith responses to pandemics. You can see there some of the sort of themes that we would be hoping to look at: a global scene setting paper, a paper on strategy and how it's working out in countries, a paper on communications and building trust in communities, and hopefully another paper on looking at that spiritual dimension of care in clinical and palliative care that Fabian has been talking to. Those series papers would hopefully inform then a WHO Commission report. And we would be hoping to follow that with an event where high-level religious leaders come together to also make commitments towards making those changes in their own house that need to be made to have effective public health. And I think then the argument that I would want to make is that the faith community is a multiple and complex social, political, and religious system. It's not just a set of hospitals. It's not just a set of worshipping houses of worship. It's not just religious leaders. I think we need to shift the way we look at the faith community from it being a problem, or we just look at bits of it. It's a bit like people who, talk about looking at the elephant and somebody's holding the tail and somebody's holding the trunk and somebody's holding the ears, and they all describe it in different ways. But I think we need to look at the faith community as a complex, sophisticated social and political system, as well as a religious system. And we need to engage with that complex system in the way that we would engage with other complex systems, such as the private sector, or such as the political sector. We don't say we're not going to engage with any political leaders because there are some bad apples. We don't say we're not going to engage with any private sector because there are some who don't have ethical motives. We have guidelines and principles to engage with complex systems that enable us to put those checks and balances in place. And so if we are able to look again at the faith partners as a complex system that we need to engage with at multiple different levels, as a leadership level, at a service delivery level, at a community level, at an educational level, then it becomes normative for countries and international public health institutions to build equitable partnerships with the faith sector in a way that's commensurate with their influence and the trust that's placed in them with communities. So moving forward, this team will continue to provide technical briefings. We'll continue to work with the communities of practice to help develop some of the tools and guidelines and resources that the faith community are requesting. We'll continue to work with the Faith Network and invite new partners, and hopefully we'll be able to launch the WHO Faith Commission and the Lancet series. So once again, an apology if I've run over time. I live in a little house in the middle of Yorkshire, and I'm speaking to you from my office at home, but I hope it's given you a flavour of faith engagement from both a personal but a professional perspective over the last nearly 40 years. And thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you.
Thank you so much, Sally. That was really fascinating. You've obviously had an incredibly busy past few decades. And it's lovely to see the pictures from Nepal. It's such a beautiful country. I was particularly fascinated by the discussion around engagement, around language and discourse, and also around being able to think about religion and faith as an enabler rather than just as a barrier. And I think we hear so much about the latter, about the problems, rather than actually some of the more positives, which clearly exist in many, many ways. And I think you've pointed to that really clearly in that discussion. I'm aware that we're actually sort of officially out of time, but I think we should make a little bit of time for some questions. I think some of the questions in the chat have been more or less answered, but I'd like to go back to Rosie's question. So Rosie asked a question when we had the break earlier, and she was talking about positionality and the northern perspective. Rosie, if you're still there, do you want to just say your question again for the three speakers to respond to?
Sure, yeah. So, and thank you for that, Sally. That was great, really interesting insight. Yeah, so if I remember rightly, it was just about positionality and why you know the WHO scale, subscale, relating to that has maybe been underused by researchers specifically, but also why, as researchers in the kind of the social and the mental health realm, the question was about whether our own positionality and the fact that for many of us, religion and spirituality may not play a huge part in our individual lives, whether that is causes us something of a blind spot, I guess, or some kind of discomfort in addressing it in our research participants, because it's, I guess my point was that it's definitely there in all the qualitative interviews that in my experience it's there for people, but maybe just not for us as researchers.
I mean, yeah, maybe Sally, who would like to respond?
I can start briefly from my own work. I published a paper some time ago, which is entitled The Neglect of Spirituality in Suicide Prevention, where I looked exactly at this, because of my experience working very closely with people with lived experience. Carer was a spirituality, religious and non-religious. Important also knowledge is non-religious spirituality, because only faith is also problematic. Because a lot of people define themselves as non-religious, but they are still spiritual, and that's important for them. Just saying that. So I was looking at the religious and non-religious spirituality, and these kind of constructs are and are part of an experience for people who survived suicide attempt. And they and some of them, actually for many of them, the ones I was close to, spirituality was the key component and about why they were still alive. And yet this was neglected in research. And one of the findings of the kind of review I was doing was exactly what you are saying. The psychiatrists and psychologists, mental health professionals are kind of fundamentally research agnostic or atheist, because they are not acknowledging the importance of this dimension in their life. I mean, not only this, but certainly can contribute to themselves not being then introducing this component in research in practice. And I think this applies for researchers in the way that you are saying. So certainly it is an aspect, but that's I think also tells less about why research should always be grounded in people's life, really coming the kind of participatory approach we talk about co-production. If it was really happening in the way we say on grants application, we will see more research that actually is about what matters to people, including religion and spirituality. That's my perspective on suicide prevention, but I don't know, Fabian or Sally, your own research.
Maybe Sally, you want to speak to it first, or? No, okay. So I'll make a brief comment. So something which I've noticed is that in a lot of this discourse, I'm not just speaking about WHO, but other UN agencies as well, religion is something which others have, right? Mm-hmm. It's something which generally Global South has, which is local. It's always kind of in this discourse of local community, Global South, and it's as if it's kind of not our thing. And I think that's problematic because it kind of reproduces this you could almost say a post-colonial discourse, which kind of searches for the irrational in the global South and pretends that we ourselves don't have this. And I think that is really where we have to think long and hard whether that is true, because spirituality is here as well. It has just changed so much that we don't recognize it anymore in the classical kind of ritualized forms that we, when we think of the Catholic Church. People are the same, but the forms of religious expression have changed so much that we don't recognize it so much anymore. And I think one example of that is the human rights discourse, which is a framework of values, where does it come from and what's it based? I don't know, but all our legal systems are based on it. I mean, it's in the Constitution, the Swiss legal system is based on it. The German one is, so it is very, very central. And for me, a form of confrontation with existential questions, which is not ritualized anymore, but nonetheless, I would say a form of modern religiosity. And another example is the obsession with self-improvement. Why? What for? Why is our society so fixated on self-improvement? If you look at in other cultures, that is not the case at all. Where does it come from? What value is there? To me, that is an existential question and answer happening in the self-improvement discourse, which if there were a few more obvious rituals to it, would be plainly religious. We don't recognize it. And so we go around finding, religious in the global South and communities and all of that, where I actually think we're not immune to it, and got to think about it maybe a bit more, So yeah, that would be my take on that.
I think it's also about the secularization of the West that has excluded public health discourse about religion and makes it non-acceptable in the academic spheres and in the public health sphere. And yet, as I was trying to say in my presentation towards the end, that a lot of the faith communities in the global North have got a lot of work going on around human rights and gender, and the intersection of human rights and gender and their own religious traditions and beliefs, and grappling with some of those perhaps inconsistencies or the challenges of living out a religious faith in the context of a very secular society, and looking at some of the inconsistencies in their own religious traditions and the former approaches to those that have led to perhaps discrimination against different groups and peoples. But that discourse in the global North is silenced in the public arena and in the policymaking arena and in the academic arena because of the dominance of secularism. And so I think if you actually look at some of the work that's going on around HIV in other geographic regions, you find a much more nuanced approach to this than we get in the West, because it's become so polarized in the West. And so I think that's why one of the things I would like to put forward into the global debate is to say it's not about the bad guys and the good guys. It's not about the North and the South. It's not about the secular and the religious. It is a very complex system. And so we need to look at it as a complex, multifaceted system and be honest about the fact that there are good bits and bad bits, both in religion, in many of the religious traditions, in the way they've been interpreted and applied, but also in politics and in our public health systems, and not be afraid of engaging with any of it because of the mistakes of some of it. And I think that's the fault that I see very often, that people will not want to engage at all because of the dangers of some of the challenges of doing so.
Thank you. Question from Arian Jackson. Do you think that in the current health and social care crisis, spiritual considerations are lost as it's not seen as a priority by many practitioners? Does anyone have any thoughts on that question?
Is it written in the chat? Sorry.
It is, yes. So the current health and social care crisis, I don't know if that relates to the UK, but we certainly have a health and social care crisis. So I think we can answer with the UK in mind.
Can you say the question again? So yeah, we can see.
Do you think in the current current health and social care crisis, spiritual considerations are lost as it's not seen as a priority by many practitioners, something that they have no time for.
Yeah, maybe I can briefly comment on that. Actually, I work with healthcare chaplains. I work at the Faculty of Theology at the Professorship for Spiritual Care. So that is healthcare chaplains and spiritual care providers in hospital settings. And there, of course, the constant battle is people making an argument that spirituality is kind of the last priority when money is tight and everything is underfunded. Do we really need a specialist for cradling your precious feelings, when people are dying? This kind of the bottom line argument, right, which is made. And there's a lot of very intelligent people who have argued against that. But it's not an easy argument to make, but I think one that is worth making. And I think a lot of suffering comes from if we make this kind of bottom line arguments, which they're not always as easy as we think, right? But more I can't say to it right now.
Okay, thank you. Richard, I know you've put a question in or comment in the chat, but you also got your hand up. So over to you.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, thank you. No, I was really just chipping in to say how much I agree with both Fabian and Sally, that the problem is a lot to do with the way the West constructs the term religion and what it thinks about religion when it uses that terminology. And I only just stumbled across this meeting in this group on Twitter and whatever like that. I do religious studies, and I'm very interested in how far the Wellcome Trust is engaged with religious studies literature, which is, religious studies is not about theology, it's not about particularities. It's a a social scientific study of religion, and there's a vast literature which, if you're not familiar with it, would probably really help push things forward. That's my comment.
Does anyone want to respond to Richard's comment? Everyone's in agreement. Great. I'm aware that we are 15 minutes over time now, so we should probably wrap up. As I mentioned at the start, Aminia's film is going to be available online in about 5 minutes' time. We'll also be showing it in the boardroom here for anyone who's here who wants to watch. There is a separate link to this, so you have to leave this room and enter the link that Chris has just put in the chat for us. So before we finish, I just want to say a huge thanks to our three speakers this afternoon. It's been really fascinating, and I'm quite sure we could talk for hours on this topic, so I'm really sorry to bring it to a close. But thank you everybody for coming along today, and especially our three speakers.
Thank you.
So we will see those of you that want to see the film in about 5 minutes' time. Thanks, guys. There's so many questions.
Yeah,
There's not enough time.
Things to think about. Yeah. But anyway, start the conversations. Some of them can be continued. Thank you so much for organizing this platform, for sharing.
I'm really sorry. I actually enjoyed my side very well.
Yeah.
But
I think there's a concept that we're really absolutely
There will be also a screens over there. So maybe
Thank you. I watched the trailer.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you so much.
Bye so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
I was thinking about Lucia and
Before, in the context
I think the
of
theme is
participatory.
I sent her a slide presentation, like she will find some.
I think we have some drinks outside in the library, so if you want to grab some drinks, you can also watch from there.
Yeah.
If you want to.